In this video, we'll brush up on the basics of jQuery. We'll go over how to access and query and manipulate the document object model so you can manipulate the actual HTML tags in your page, as well as some of the CSS styling. We'll talk about how to download jQuery from the website and use it in your projects. We'll talk about how to use jQuery via CDN. And some of the upsides and downsides of why you might want to do it one way or the other. We'll talk about some of the basic jQuery selectors, which, if you remember right, are also CSS selectors. We'll talk about how to manipulate and query the DOM with jQuery. And finally, we'll talk about event handling with jQuery. Let's go over how to install jQuery first. So to install jQuery, you can do it one of two ways. You can either download the files and include the actual scripts in your projects, or you can use them over what's called a CDN, a content delivery network. So to get access to jQuery and find out a lot about it and read more, you'll want to go to jQuery.com. And there's a lot of comprehensive, if you go to the website, you'll find a lot of comprehensive documentation as well as tutorials. You'll see on the website there is a little link here called API documentation. If you go into there, you will learn everything you would possibly need to know about jQuery. Going back to the home page, there's a link also on the right to the jQuery Learning Center. You'll find several helpful tutorials to get you up and running on that page. And to download jQuery, you'll go up here to the top left. So go under Download. There's a few different versions of jQuery available. There is a compressed production version. That's what we call a minified version. Most of the white space has been taken out, and variable names have been shortened to make for a smaller download size. That's generally the one you want to use. There is also an uncompressed, what we call development version, where all the white space is still there and all the variable names have been preserved. So if for some reason you need to look into how a function is implemented in jQuery, this can be valuable, but in general, this is the file you want to download. Now, if you click on the link, you'll see it takes you directly to the code itself, right? Well, we want to actually have this file in our project. So what I want to do instead is I'm going to right-click on the link and say Save Link As. And then I can save this file into whatever project I'm working on. So that's how I can download it from the website. There is also an option, if you scroll down further, you'll get to CDNs. So under here, go to Stack. Well, no, we don't want Stack. CDNs. Well, there's one. There it is. There's the link that I'm looking for. So there's a link here to code.jquery.com. You can actually go in there directly with your browser. The one thing to make sure that when you visit this page, make sure you visit it with HTTPS. That way you'll get the proper code. If you go and visit with HTTP, you'll get a different code segment, which will not be what you want. You want to make sure you get it with HTTPS. So let's go, once we found it here, we'll see jQuery core. That's what we want. There's the same kind of versions that we saw with downloading it. You can see there's an uncompressed version, which is that developer version. There's the minified version, which is the production version. That's the one we want. But you also see there's two versions that are slim. Slim does not include a large chunk of jQuery. It's only a small chunk of jQuery that's included in Slim, but what we want is the full jQuery, so we're going to grab the minified. Okay. When you click on the minified link, you're going to get a script tag like this. You'll just copy that and bring that into your code, put that into the head or the end of the body, and then you will have you'll have jQuery in your project. As we mentioned previously, though, especially because this is being pulled from a CDN, I would recommend adding either the defer attribute here or at least adding a preload so that it knows to download it, to start downloading it earlier. Okay. So that's where to get it. We looked at the Learning Center briefly, and that's you can get to directly through learn.jquery.com. We talked about how to download it from the download page, and again, make sure you get the compressed production version if you are going to download it. If you're going to get through the CDN, make sure you get the minified version. Also make sure you have the HTTPS. If you look at the code snippet that you get in the pop-up, you'll notice that there's two properties on it, integrity and cross-origin. Integrity gives kind of a checksum for that file that you're getting. That's really important for security. That means that somebody can't hack into the jQuery server, upload a malicious script, and now that malicious script is part of your website. That's really important. Anonymous is also important to protect your users' identity, because what cross-origin anonymous says, don't send any login credentials to this website. So both of these things, the integrity value here, that hash, as well as the cross-origin anonymous, both of these are vital for security, so please make sure you keep them on there. It's also possible to get jQuery via NPM. We'll talk about how to use NPM in the upcoming weeks, at which point that may be a way that you consider going forward is using jQuery via NPM. But for now, we're going to just use the routes that we've learned so far, which is either to download from the website or via CDN. All right, so let's talk about briefly what a CDN is as a refresher. You can host any of your front-end libraries over a CDN. We don't do that with our back-end technologies. We're just going to do this with our front-end. But it's worth asking why you might want to do that and why you might not want to do that. So a content delivery network in general is a geographically distributed network of servers designed to deliver static content. It's not meant to deliver content that's dynamic or generally based on a database. There are some systems that can help you with that, but in general, it's best suited for static content. So one of the things you'll notice in that terminology, it says geographically distributed. So what that means is if you're downloading it from a CDN, that CDN actually has a lot of servers, and they have them spread out across the globe. So you're more likely, if you're just hosting it on your own server, well, your server might be here in the US, it's going to be really slow for somebody to download it in Russia. So they have servers around the globe, maybe they have one in Russia as well. If your user is in Russia, they can download the file from there and get to it quicker. China, India, anywhere across the globe. So that can be really helpful with that in consideration. And also recognize that it's more than one server, right? So it may be just for a simple site that you only have one server. If you're working with a CDN, that CDN now has more servers, and that can lead to a little bit more stability. CDNs can also cache the content for your websites, including HTML pages, CSS style sheets, JavaScript files, images, videos. Anything that's static content, a CDN can cache. In this case, we're just talking about caching jQuery, which is just a script, but really you can get your CDN to do all you can purchase a subscription or use CDN to do a lot of things more than just hosting other people's scripts. You can host your content there too. So when the user loads a web page, they generally receive these files from a server that is geographically closest to them. So wherever they're located, we talked about this previously, the browser will automatically figure out, the browser and the network, the servers will figure out, the CDN will figure out which server is closest to them, and they'll actually download it from that one automatically. Using a CDN does means that you don't actually physically download the files onto your server. You're simply going to let the browser get them when it needs them. So you don't actually need to have them as part of your project if you're using them over the CDN. You just need to have a link in your HTML to say, okay, go find the file over here. However, it's worth noting that you do have to have stable internet access because those files are always being downloaded over the internet. If you don't have an internet connection, well, you're not going to be able to access any of those files that are on CDN. So if for whatever reason you need to be able to work on your website offline without an internet access, or if you don't have stable internet access, I would strongly recommend downloading the file instead of using a CDN for development. Some of the advantages of using a CDN is it can decrease your server load because the content's spread out across a bunch of different servers. That means that the individual load on each server is reduced. So let's say you have 1,000 users and 4 servers. Well, rather than having those 1,000 users all go to one server to get those files, they can now be split, so there's only about 250 people going to each server. That means that each of those 4 servers experience less load. And then that's going to mean that you don't need as good hardware for each of those 4 servers, not as expensive hardware, but it also means that they can handle more users. So because you have more servers, you can handle more users in there. It does make, so decreased server load also leads to faster content delivery, because generally the CDN servers are going to be faster than your application server, because they tend to have pretty good hardware and pretty good network connections, but they're only meant for serving static content. Because they're only serving static content, they don't have to go through the database or any sort of application logic to retrieve that content, and that's also part of what makes them faster, because they don't have to run any logic. You just say, oh, this is a file you want, here you go. They can also often cache the file, whether in memory or places in the file system that are quicker to access. So a lot of times those files are quicker to get to because they're optimized for serving static files than they may be on your own server. There's also a very high probability that whoever visits your website has already downloaded the library from a CDN. So for instance, if we're using Bootstrap from a CDN, there's a very good chance, especially if we're using the latest version of Bootstrap, there's a very good chance that they've already downloaded Bootstrap for another website. So they may actually already have a copy of it and not need to download it again. CDNs could also lead to higher availability because they can dynamically fall back to other servers because they're made up of servers. If just one server goes offline, if a server goes offline for maintenance, it means that all your traffic can be rerouted to a different server. So what that means is they can offer close to 100% availability, even if there's larger scale power, network, or hardware outages. Your application server, especially if you're only working with one, might not be able to handle a large scale outage. Say, hey, the power goes out in the East Coast or the West Coast, or there's a problem with the internet and the network and that whole site. Well, then your server's offline. So if CDNs that are set up well are really robust in terms of being able to scale and fall back and move things around so that your files don't go offline. They also can provide an amount of security because they're dynamically distributed multiple servers. It can make it a lot harder for somebody to execute a distributed denial of service on your servers because they have just a lot more servers to hit, but those servers are going to also move around a little bit. potentially changing their IP address and things like that. Or knowing, hey, there's a pattern. All 5 of these servers are getting a bunch of hits from this set of IPs. Well, that's probably a DDoS attack. All right. We talked about the advantages of CDNs. There are some disadvantages about CDNs. We kind of mentioned some of this already. One of the big disadvantages is that they do need internet access. So if for some reason you're in a place where you don't have internet access, or that internet access isn't stable, and that can be often a problem in third world countries or developing nations, where that may not be they may have an internet connection, but it may not be fast or reliable. Also on mobile, if you're traveling around a lot, they can pose some additional problems with that, because you're moving from network to network, and your connection may not be always stable. So it may be that as you're traveling on a train or a bus or something like that, it may be that your connection comes in and out as you're switching between different networks. So some files may be loaded here, and then you may find that they go away, depending on the state of that connection. That can still obviously happen if you're hosting it on your own server, but there are some compounding things to think about when you're looking at a CDN. In order for also the other side with internet, if you're hosting the files yourself, then whoever's using your website only needs access to your application. They don't need to get out to the broader internet to access other websites. But as soon as you introduce a CDN, now they not only need to be able to access your website, but they may need to access other websites as well. And that fact that they need to access other websites makes it not a really good fit for things like intranet applications that are internal to the company, that don't need to be visible to the outside world, or for certain government applications, especially where security is a concern. So that fact that internet access is required for CDNs can be a big deal in certain applications. It really depends on what you're doing. So think about that as you're working, as you make that choice, because it is a big decision. It's also worth noting that CDNs can fail too. They are much less likely to fail than your own servers, because they're only serving static content, so that they don't run into a lot of the problems that your application can run into, a lot of things that can make your application go down. They're also spread across all those different servers, so if there's an issue with one, it doesn't necessarily trickle down to all of them. But there have been cases where CDNs have gone down. Even Cloudflare has had a case or two, and I've got an article link here about, hey, this is what happened, and it took a large piece of the internet down with it. It doesn't happen frequently, and it's in that case where the cases where Cloudflare's had some issues, those outages have been fairly brief, and usually pretty localized. But do be aware that while they are more resilient, they're not impervious to outages. The speed and availability of some of the CDN, those servers can be affected. Can also be affected by the number of users that are on the CDN. So if there's increased traffic to other websites, that can actually slow down the traffic to the CDN resources as a whole. And that does mean that if there's a lot of people on the internet, you're in a high traffic time or window or area, that can mean that your page slows down because there's a lot of people using some other website. And again, depending on what CDN you're using and the current state of things, it can be that the actual download speed from your server might be slower than having your own server. And that varies a lot by region and by time of day, and and by the particular host that you're using for your CDN. So keep that in mind. Sometimes their download speed may be faster than yours, and sometimes it may be faster from your own server. But you also have to keep in mind of well, it may be faster from your own server when you're testing it, right? When we're testing it in America, it might not necessarily be faster from your own site if you're testing it in another country. So do keep that in mind. It's not a necessarily one size fits all. You know, what speed you experience may not be the speed that your user experiences. Okay, so we talked about CDNs and why you might use a CDN, why you might not use a CDN. Just think about what makes sense for the application that you're building. So let's talk about selectors, and let's talk about selecting the DOM elements using jQuery. So the DOM elements, the selectors in jQuery are really a superset of the ones in CSS. In jQuery, you can use all the selectors that exist in CSS, plus some additional ones that jQuery provides. So the basic ones being the universal selector, which lets you select everything. You can use the type selector to select tags of a certain type, and that's without any sort of prefix. Universal selector is star. You can use the class selector to select elements that have a certain class. Remember that elements can have more than one class. You're going to do that with the period. Or you can select elements by ID, and remember that starts with a hash. You can also select elements by attribute, as we talked about previously. Okay. Combinators also exist and work with jQuery. So you can use the descendant combinator, which is just a space and says, hey, this element has to be a descendant of this other element, or a direct descendant or a child combinator with that little greater than sign, or you can use the sibling combinators. Grouping also works, so if you want to say these elements and these elements, you can put a comma and say this selector, that selector. Alright, so let's talk about how might that look when you want to use jQuery to select an item by ID. So if I've got a simple form like some simple form controls like this, so I've got two inputs here. They're both number inputs. One is for Fahrenheit, one is for Celsius. I'm going to write a quick script here, and I'm going to say I want to refer to both of these items by their ID. So here with my selector, you can see hash Fahrenheit, hash Celsius. So that's get the element by the Fahrenheit. You'll see I put these in single quotes. You can put them in double quotes or single quotes, but per style convention, please use single quotes. You're also then going to put that into this, what looks like a method call, because it is, to the jQuery object. So what this is going to do is you say, okay, I want the element with this ID. Here's my selector. We'll then wrap it using the jQuery object, so we get a jQuery wrapper. This is kind of our set of elements that we're working with. So we get that set of elements, and then we can call val. Val gives us the current, allows us to either get the current value of that element or that input, or allows us to set it. So in this case, we're passing a value, which means that we're going to set it. So we're going to set the value in this field to 212, and then we're also going to set the value of Celsius to 100. So I can use that ID selector to refer to the element by its ID and do all sorts of things with it in my code. Next, I can also use the class selector. So in this case, maybe I want to say all of the elements in the form, I want to clear them out. So here I'm saying, well, select everything that has the class form control and set its value to empty string. So that's going to mean that both of these fields become blank. So an ID selector you can use to select a single element. A class selector you can use to select a group of elements. the same class. So jQuery selectors in general borrow from CSS 1 through 3, but they also add their own. jQuery offers a very powerful set of tools for matching elements and matching sets of elements in a document. It's kind of a word from the jQuery documentation. You can follow this link to see the full list of selectors that are available in jQuery. Again, they're all the ones in CSS 3 plus some additional ones that are available with jQuery. For most, there's nothing per se new that you can't do with just using the CSS selectors. What they do provide, the additional ones, are simply shorthands for things that you could do with just plain CSS. Alright, let's talk about the document object model and how to work with it. You briefly saw there we looked at the val method, and that's one way to get access to the properties and attributes and the values in your page. But there's a few other methods that we can use to get and set values. So first up is val. So if you use it as such, val always refers to the current value of the element, and you're going to use it with it only works with two fields. So it works with the input, two tags. It works with the input elements and it works with the output elements. So you can get and set the value of inputs and outputs. So if I want to get the value, I'm going to call it like this, .val, no parameter. That gives me the value of it. But if I want to change the value, then I need to pass in a value. So this is the getter with no value. This is the setter with a value. So this is going to set it to 100. Similarly, if I want to look at work with the HTML, all the content that's inside of an element, I can use the HTML method. So if I pass that without a value, that will give me the HTML that's inside of it. Or if I want to change the HTML that's there, I can pass in a string. So here it will change the HTML to be a header, a H2 header with the text done. And that's worth noting there. When I set HTML like this, I can actually put in my own HTML tags dynamically. Next up is prop, short for property. Gives you the value of a property of an element. So for instance, in this case, I want to get the check property of a checkbox. So I would access that as prop checked. Checked is the name of the property. So if I write it this way, just the name of the property, this will return the value of the check property, which is going to be true or false. If I want to change the value of the property, I can use the setter this way. So I give it the name of the property and then the value I want to set it to. So this gives me the value, this sets the value to true. Next up is ATTR, attribute. Attributes and properties are very similar, but there are some slight nuances to how they work. So do read the documentation on that to kind of get an idea of which one should you use. In general, if it's a Boolean attribute, you should definitely use the prop. If it's not a Boolean attribute, then attribute it may be a better pick. So for instance, in this case, I want to get the source of an image, right? So what URL does that image tag point to? Or I could set the source if I pass in a value. So here's the getter, just the name of the attribute, but no value. Here I set it with the name of the attribute plus the value. So this will change it to cat.jpg. So change it from whatever image it was showing to a cat picture, cat photo. I can also manually work with the CSS using the CSS method. Now this you do have to be aware will get and set inline CSS. So remember, just like you have problems with, just like inline CSS can cause problems with responsive design, do be wary about using this method to change CSS. It's usually better to change a class or to add or remove a class, like we'll talk about in a minute, rather than directly changing a CSS property this way, because you're effectively setting inline CSS when you do this. So here I'm going to say I want to get the current color of the result element. Okay, so this will give me the color because I just passed in the name of the CSS property. And here I'm going to set it. So here I've given it the name of the property, the CSS property, and then, or the CSS, the style, as you might say. And here we're going to set it to red. So this will get the color of the result element, the text color, and this would set the text color to red. So you can use that to directly change CSS properties, which sometimes can be useful, but you do have to be very wary about it simply because you're doing inline CSS. Okay, next up let's talk about classes. So if you do want to add or remove classes, you can do it. It is possible to do it through the ATTR method, or you can say in CSS through the CSS method. I would recommend using these methods instead if you need to work with classes. Okay, so the first method on this list is hasClass, and hasClass will tell you if that element does or does not have the class in question. It may have other classes. It just tells you whether or not it has the class that you told it. So this will return true if the result element has the class TextDanger. It will return false if it doesn't have this class. AddClass will then let you add a class to whatever classes it already has. So here we're going to say let's add the class TextDanger, or remove class we can use to remove a class. So we can add a class or we can remove it, and we can check whether or not it has that class. So if I say remove class TextDanger, it will remove that and leave any other classes that are already there. Finally, we've got ToggleClass. So ToggleClass will turn that off and on. So ToggleClass says if this class isn't there, if danger is not on that result, well then we'll turn it on, but if it's already there, then we'll turn it off. So that can be helpful for certain things. So you can either add it, remove it, toggle it, or you can check whether or not it has it. Okay. It's also worth noting that you can chain these methods together. So you can use a series of these methods all as one line, because each of these methods, as you're working through with jQuery, will return the original set of elements. So in general, so this returns the image element. You can then say, okay, well let's set the source. Let's set the source to catpng. So we'll change the image, and we'll also change the alt. I didn't have to do this as 2 lines. I can do that as 1 to change both of those properties. Similarly, if I want to change the result, maybe I want to add some classes. Here I'm adding TextDanger and P3 for padding, and then I'm changing the HTML. So I can do both of those things with what we call chaining here, which is a series of method calls where it's dot this method, dot that method, etc. And you can change these as long as you need to. So you don't have to do this. You can write this as multiple lines, but this does make your code a little bit more compact if you chain methods together. Okay, so we talked about how to manipulate the DOM. Let's talk about how to work with events now. So there's a few events that we use pretty often. There's a long list of events that are available, but the list of events that we actually use on the regular is pretty small. So the first one up is the change event. Okay, so the change event occurs typically when a form field changes. Now there's a little bit more nuance to that. The reason that you might want to use this is to provide quicker feedback to the user about whether or not a field is invalid, or to do some checking ahead of time to maybe send it to the server and say, hey, is that name in use, or such things? Is it a valid format? So you can do some checking ahead of time with your form inputs. So for text inputs and text areas, you need to understand though that this event doesn't fire until the control loses focus. Until the user leaves the field, The change event does not fire for text inputs and text areas. So do be aware of that as you're designing your fields, and recognize that that's going to be the end user experience. Radio buttons and checkboxes, however, the events are fired immediately when you click it. If I click a checkbox, click a radio button, it'll fire the event that the state changed immediately. Also with select dropdowns, the event with select dropdowns, the event fires when the user makes a new selection. Now, what that means is the sequence of actions they've got to do to change that. There's kind of two pathways. So the first pathway is if they click on it. Remember, the dropdown will come down. It will then happen once they pick an item from the dropdown. If, on the other hand, if you're using the keyboard, simply using the up or down arrow key will immediately trigger the change without the dropdown even appearing. So the up and down arrow keys can directly invoke that. The next one is going to be the click event, and that's anytime the user clicks or taps on an item. That you can use for all sorts of inputs. I would be wary about using this on the submit button or the reset button, but for other buttons and for other controls, this is a good idea. And with I should mention, with these, once we go back to the change event, the general structure of how we write this code, you'll see we have a selector. So we select, hey, this is the Celsius control, and then I'm going to say .change. So give it a handler for when give it a function for call this function when the field changes. So it takes an event object as its input, and then you put the body of the function here, the logic that you want it to do when the field changes in response to it. Similarly, if you want to respond to a click event, you say, okay, well, I need a selector first for what thing do I care about listening that event on. I'm going to say .click, and then provide a handler for that. So here we're providing a handler for the click event, so what to do in response to that. You can also listen to key down events, and that's the same kind of structure. You just change this to a key down is the method. That key down fires whether it's a hardware keyboard or if it's a software keyboard. So if they're on mobile, they might have the soft keyboard that pops up. Key down triggers from that, but it'll also trigger if you have a hardware keyboard. And this can be useful, especially with when you're working with text inputs or text areas, and maybe you want to provide quicker feedback than just when they tap out of it. The key down event can help you provide that feedback sooner, immediately after they press the button. The thing you do have to be aware of, though, if your code is long running, this can be an issue here, because now this code has to run before they can press the next key. So if you do put any logic into the key down event, it needs to execute very quickly and not block the UI, because otherwise it will be perceived as bad performance. Your application will seem really slow as they're typing in. So make sure whatever logic you put into a key down event is fast. You can also listen for when an element gets focus. Using the focus event, you'll see it's a dot focus method. Other than that, it's the same. You can also listen for when the element loses focus. That's what we refer to as blur. So focus is when it gets focus. Blur is when it loses focus. And these are other places where you may want to use those for validation purposes, or to highlight the relevant field that they're working on. Two events now we want to talk about briefly. Both of these events are not on the inputs, not the individual fields. All the other events we've talked about so far are about the individual form inputs, selects and text areas and such. These two events that we'll talk about now are on the form. So you'll notice my selector refers to the ID of the form, it won't refer to the ID of the control or the ID of the button. It needs to refer to the ID of the form. So here I say submit, and then I'm going to tell it what logic to run in response to the form being submitted. Now it's worth knowing there are in general two ways for a form to be submitted. The first way is that you click or activate in some way the submit button. The second way for a form to be submitted is if you press enter on a text field. If you press enter on a text field of form, that will cause the form to be submitted, regardless of whether or not it's the first field in the form or the last. Okay. Now, if I want to listen for the reset event, this is also on the form. In this case, there's not a shorthand like the others have a shorthand, so you do have to write it as on reset. You can't just write it as reset. There is no reset method in jQuery. You have to write that as a event. So this you can respond to when the form is reset, and typically what we do there is we're going to get rid of all the error messages. The reset event automatically resets all the fields back to what they originally were when the page loads, but it won't clear out any sort of error messages that you may have shown along with those fields. So that's typically the thing we do in this reset event is we just need to reset our error messages because the values will go back to what they were originally. But notice that both of these, the submit event and the reset event, both of these are on the form itself, not on the form controls. So you don't put those on the submit button or the reset button like you might with other things. You put those on the form. We can listen to all sorts of there's a lot more events in JavaScript that we might want to listen to, and we can listen to any of those using the on or the trigger method. The ones we talked about at the beginning, those are all shorthands for on and trigger. So the way if I want to say I want to respond to an event, I can write it this way. I just say use my selector.on. Here's the name of the event. So on will let me register for any event I want. I just need to provide a selector and the name of the event. And then I can also use trigger to fire an event. So in this case, I want to say, let's reset the form. So I'm going to take the form and say trigger the reset event. So on will let me register a handler for an event. Trigger will let me fire that event, make that event happen. Other methods you may want to use with jQuery are the preventDefault method. The preventDefault method tells the browser that it shouldn't do its normal action, the normal things that it would do in response to you submitting a form or clicking a button or clicking a link. So for instance, with links, their normal behavior is that it should navigate you or scroll you. It should either navigate you to another page or to scroll you down to the part of page that it refers to if it's just an internal link. So both of those things are the default behavior. If you want to stop it from doing that, you need to call preventDefault, so it won't do that. Similarly, submitting events, submitting the form will typically mean that it navigates to another page and sends those values along. So we may want to prevent it from submitting because there's invalid values in it, or we may be doing things with Ajax where we want to submit it without a page refresh. So doing a preventDefault will prevent it from doing its normal submission process and from changing the page. Similarly, if we, for instance, maybe want to provide a reset button, the normal behavior of the reset button is it will reset all the input fields back to their original values. But we might want to change that to reset the values to values that we pick, or the more common case with the reset event is we want to provide some sort of confirmation. Maybe they click reset accidentally, they don't want to necessarily, that may be an issue. We may not want them to then immediately lose all the values that they've entered. So one of the things that we sometimes do is we say, okay, well, let's show a quick dialogue to ask them, are you sure? Are you sure you want to delete this? And then we'll prevent the default action if they say, yes, I don't actually want to reset, or we'll go ahead and let it go through if they confirm that prompt. Stop propagation can also be helpful if you have more than one event handler on an element, whether it be a form or a form field. Stop propagation tells the browser that, okay, I'm the last handler that you should listen to. Don't listen to any of the other handlers that are next. That's not one that we use too often, because we oftentimes try to kind of avoid having more than one handler for something. But if you do get yourself into a boat where you have more than one handler, that stop propagation will stop all the other handlers. Now, it's worth noting that the order is important. The order of your event handlers is important when it comes to stop propagation, because stop propagation doesn't stop any of the event handlers that have already run. It only stops the ones that are next in the list. Okay, so let's look at an example, kind of putting all these pieces together that we've talked about today. So let's say I want to build a form that's got two fields. It's got two input fields, a price and a tax. Okay, so we're going to input the price, we're going to input the tax, and then if I put values in both of those, then we're going to tell the user what the total cost of that is, price plus the tax. If they don't provide values for either of those, then we're going to give them an error message telling them that they need to enter both the price and a percentage. So let's start up at the top. So we've got a form that we've given the ID calc-tax form. Okay, so we got our form tag with that. And we're saying we want to respond to when that form is submitted. So when the user clicks the submit event, the submit button on that form. We're going to say, first of all, prevent the default behavior, because we don't want the form to submit and take the user to another page. We want to keep them on the same page. And then we're going to grab the values from the inputs. So here I'm first trying to get the price, so I'm using a price selector, and then I'm saying .val. That will give me the value of that. Now it's worth noting val pretty much always will come back as a string. So I want to actually be able to do math with this, which means that I need to convert these values to floats. So I'm going to take that value that's as a string, called parse float, and that will take the string, turn it into an actual number. Similarly with the tax, I'm going to go use an ID selector for the tax input, get the current value of it, and then turn it into a floating point number. So now that I've got those two inputs, and you'll see I've marked them as const, because once I've gotten these values, I don't want them to change, because these are the two values that the user has entered. So I've got the input. Now I need to check if that input is valid. So if they've entered both a price and a tax, then it's valid. Otherwise, it's invalid. And you'll notice I'm using those falsy checks there to simplify the logic. So if they do enter both a price and a tax, then we're going to compute the total cost. So let's look into this calculation. So the first thing I'm doing is I need to figure out kind of the percentage or the multiplier for the tax. So first I'm going to say we need to divide the tax by 100, and that's assuming that the way the user's entering it is a number from 0 to 100. Okay, so we need to make that a number between 0 and 1 to do our math. So I'm going to take the number from 0 to 100, divide it by 100. That will then give me a number from 0 to 1. So that scales it down effectively to a number between 0 and 1. And then I'm also adding 1. I'm adding 1 because I need the full price. I'm saying, okay, if I have 5%, well, 5% divide that by 100. Now I have 0.05, and then I need to add 1 so that I have the original, the 100% of the original cost. If I didn't have this 1 plus here, then I would be just getting the amount of the tax, not the total cost. So this gives me that the price plus the total plus the tax. So then we're going to say multiply this number, so if it's 5%, that would be times 1.05, and multiply that by price. So let's say multiply here is 1.05, price is $100, that comes out as 105. And then finally, the thing I'm doing here, I said math.ceil. What that does is it rounds up the amount, which I think I might have a slight error on that, because math.ceil rounds it up to the closest whole number. I do actually would need to round it to the closest hundredths. So for simplicity, I'm just going to drop that. So I've got my total. This is now as a floating point number because remember I started with price and taxes as both floating point numbers. I've done my multiplication here. You'll see I'm dividing by 100 plus and adding 1. That may look like those are integers, but remember that there is no such thing as an integer really in JavaScript. So in this case, both the 1 and the 100 are actually floating point numbers. You can think of them as having a 1.0 or 100.0 if you're familiar with, if you're thinking about C#. So both of those points are floating point numbers. There's not any sort of integer math happening here. All of this in floating point. All right, so I've got a floating point number for total, and then I want to tell the user, I want to show the user that value. So my result element, I've got not element with the ID of result. That's where I want to put the output. So I'm going to change the content of that output element using the HTML method. And so when we use the HTML method, provided a string, that's what's going to go there instead. You'll notice the backticks at the beginning and the end. Remember that means that this is a template string. So I'm going to tell the user that their total is blah US dollars. Okay. So you see I have the $ curly brace at the beginning, curly brace at the end. That means that this is a placeholder value. This is where I want to inject my data. So I'm going to say let's take the total and call toFixed2 on it. If I just put the total there, then it would have an arbitrary number of decimal places. The toFixed2, make sure that it's shown rounded to the hundredths decimal place, rounded to 2 decimal places. Because we're talking about money, that means it's going to be rounded to the closest cent. So that's what we get. So this would in the end say your total is $105.00. So toFixed guarantees that we have 2 decimal places here. And then down here we say, well, if the price and tax, if either of those is not valid, we'll run this else logic and instead tell the user, please enter a price and tax percentage. So this is our good, happy path. We show the user the total. If it's not valid, then we just say, okay, here's your error message. So that way we can, this is kind of, putting some of those elements together. You can see the handler that we're hooking up to the submit event here with the selector. You can see that we're preventing the default. We can see that we're using that val to get the value of the inputs, and then finally we're using this HTML method to display the output. Okay, so that's the end here. Just to refresh on what we talked about in this video. We went over first how to download jQuery, where to get it, where to install it. We looked at how to download it from the website or how to use a CDN to integrate it with our website. We talked about some of the pros and cons of downloading it versus using a CDN. The big one of those being that if you're using it from a CDN, then your end user or your development environment does have to have a stable internet connection. So if that is a problem or a security concern, then definitely download it. We talked about how to use some of the basic jQuery selectors. Remember, those are those are same ones that we saw with CSS. So we talked about the universal selectors available, the tag selector, the class selector, as well as the ID selector. The most common one that we use is going to be the ID selector, because usually when we're working with jQuery, we're, especially with forms and form validation, we're usually targeting specific elements. Although, using class selectors definitely has some merits in some cases for different things that you may be doing. We talked about how to manipulate and query the DOM with jQuery, and then finally we talked about how to handle events with jQuery and some of those common events that you might want to listen for. There are a few useful resources that you'll find online. The jQuery website is a great place to start. Looking through their API documentation is also good. And in one article that you might be interested in as well is this article on jQuery Learn, the Learning Center, about handling events. Alright, so that's the end of this video, and I will see you later.